basically all Section 8 is, it's like, it's like if I'm renting and I can't pay my rent and my mom's paying part of my rent, like that's it. She's got nothing to do with anything else, with the lease part. She's just giving me money to pay the rent. And then that's the difference. I feel like what I did notice was a lot of times people jumped into being a Section 8 landlord, but then they didn't really understand how the program worked, and they would ask questions afterwards. So I would always tell people, if this is something that you want to do, don't wait for the housing authority to give you the information, because if it's run poorly, they won't. Try to find the information out on yourself. You can ask someone like me or contact the housing authority and just, try to figure out and get all your ducks in a row before you do it so that you're prepared. Because it's a beast of a thing, for real.
Yeah. One of the things, I love it.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. I'm your host, Eric Worrell. I work at rentprep.com, a tenant screening service, and we try and answer as many questions as you have about, managing rental properties, growing a rental portfolio. And probably one of the areas that I feel the least adequate in is talking about Section 8. It's kind of a scary topic for some landlords. Some landlords swear by it. Some landlords hate it. And a lot of landlords are just intimidated by the entire process. So we had somebody reach out to us via our Facebook group, the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group, and her name is Sara McGraw-Abdall. And we did a live video where we did a Q&A and we answered people's questions. And I thought that video was really helpful and I learned a lot from it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pull the audio in from that conversation. And so you guys can listen here on the podcast and learn a little bit about Section 8 and some of the things that you need to do as a landlord and as a tenant and what the requirements are. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Sara McGraw-Abdall. How you doing, Sara?
I'm awesome. Thanks for asking. How are you?
I'm doing great. So we were talking right before we got on here. We're going to be talking all about Section 8. So if you're part of the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group, we get a lot of comments about Section 8, and sometimes there's misinformation. Some people are afraid of it. Some people love it. So we thought it would be helpful to just do an entire video on Section 8. And Sara, tell me a little bit about your background, because I know that you've dealt with Section 8 from the housing authority side, from the property management side. Tell us a little bit about your experience and where you're coming from.
Okay. So I've done property management for 10 years. I'm from Virginia and I've been in Arizona for a year. And so my background has been in Virginia. I've done, tax credit properties. I've done conventional properties. I've done military housing. I did Section 8 when I came here to Phoenix. That's when I learned more about Section 8 and how it worked. And I worked for the city of Phoenix, Section 8, for 9 months. I was a contractor. And then I left when my contract ended and I started my own business.
Okay. So right now you have a business, the Landlord Liaisons, where you're consulting with landlords, especially ones that want to work with Section 8 or the programs. Is that right?
Yeah. Helping them. They want to be Section 8 landlords. And then basically just helping landlords in general, overall, just improve their processes and help them make a better impact in their community and with their tenants as well.
Okay. And right now you're a full-time property manager as well?
Right now I'm an office manager for a property management and real estate company that's out in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Okay, cool. So we were talking before we got on that there was one question that kind of really summed up a lot of the questions that we got, because we kind of teased this to the Facebook group asking people for questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw that on screen right now. And I thought that we could kind of break this question down because you provided me a bunch of your responses to this and your answers. So we're going to go through step by step and talking about this question from Joan. So what Joan Mershon asked, and she's actually somebody who works with renters in the Portland, Oregon area, was she said, if you could please provide a clear delineation of expectations and responsibilities when it comes to the tenants, the landlord, and the housing authority. So I think what we had talked about is starting first kind of on the landlord responsibility side of it, right?
Right.
So let me pull up my handy little agenda here, and then hopefully I don't screw us up in the order. The first thing we're talking about is tenant screening from the landlord's responsibility as it pertains to Section 8. How does that work?
Okay. So for tenant screening, so basically Section 8 tenants are subject to the same qualifying standards as a non-Section 8 tenant. The housing authority, they do a background check, but it's based loosely on the income level of the tenant. So all landlords, like across the board, should be doing their own background screening, criminal credit, all of that. Like don't just depend on the housing authority to do it.
And it's not something where a landlord has to make any kind of differentiators in their screening criteria because the person's Section 8. Like a crime's a crime, an eviction's an eviction, right. All of that.
A tenant, like Section 8 tenant, is the same as a non-Section 8 tenant. The only thing difference is how the payment is, but they're subjected to the same rules and regulations you would have for a non-Section 8 tenant.
So as far as the payment, the way that I understand it is, let's say that you have an apartment that's $1,000 and you have a 3x rent multiplier, right? So a normal tenant would have to be making $3,000 a month to live there. I think the only difference, right, is that a Section 8 tenant is going to they're not going to have to make $1,000 or $3,000 a month because 75% or whatever the percentage is going to be paid by the housing authority. That's part of the income, right? That gets included as far as
it gets. Yeah, and then like their vouchers are good for like a certain amount. How that works is like a little bit complicated. So, but basically, the renters, they do need to make
enough to kind of cover their portion.
Yeah, enough to kind of cover it. Well, because sometimes Section 8 pays all people's rent, and sometimes it just pays a portion of the rent. It just depends on the tenant, like what the tenant's income is in the household, and then. Yeah, so it all depends like that.
So we'll move forward. We covered tenant screening. The second aspect of a landlord's responsibility. So I have a question here because you put passing HQS inspections. What does HQS stand for anyone who might not know?
The housing quality standards.
Okay. Sorry. No, that's all right. So what do those housing quality standards look like? It looks like you kind of just dropped off. Hopefully we'll get you back on here. I'll pull it up and chat with you. But from my understanding, the housing quality standards, you have an inspection of the housing where it can be anything from, and jumping back in, which is great because
oh my gosh,
it's live, right? So I was just saying the housing quality standards, right? It's like things like peeling paint. What are some other things that people have to be aware of?
Okay. So like peeling paint, like make sure like the doors and the windows, like all the locks and everything work. Like normally how it is, on the housing authority's website, somewhere on there, it'll list and it'll say like HQS inspections. Like it'll be the list that they use so that the landlord will know ahead of time what is going to be expected, like what the inspector is looking for.
Do you know, does that vary by housing authority?
I've only worked for one housing authority, and that was the city of Phoenix. So, but I know all of our stuff was on the website, and I looked at other housing authorities in Arizona. But I would assume like across the board it would be on there, and if not on there, then as a landlord, I would ask the housing authority, if they could provide me with something like ahead of time.
So this might be a really basic question, but like, what exactly is a housing authority? I mean, how does it pertain? Like, is it a government owned business or how does it work? I mean, I'm kind of a little clueless on that.
So the housing authority, well, I mean, I don't know the background of like how housing authorities operate, but I know like the relationship between the housing authority and like HUD, because HUD pays the housing authority to run the programs.
Okay.
So I would say the housing authority it's government related.
Yeah. Well, you know a lot more than I do about it. So you got your HQS inspections. If you're a landlord that's interested in doing Section 8, maybe one of the first things you want to do is check out your local housing authorities and see if they have on their website somewhere where they'll let you know what their inspection requirements are. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is you had mentioned collecting security deposits as far as landlord responsibilities. How is that handled?
Okay. So basically Section 8 doesn't pay the security deposit. So it's up to the landlord. They're responsible for collecting a security deposit. My experience was a lot of the landlords that we dealt with when I was working for the city of Phoenix, they never got security deposits. So then when the tenant moved out and their place was a mess, they came to Section 8 and wanted Section 8 to pay. It doesn't work like that. So as a landlord, if you require your non-Section 8 tenants to have a security deposit, then you should have security deposit should be required across the board because Section 8 is not going to give you any money for any damage. And a lot of the times when the tenants didn't have the money to pay for the security deposit, there was like third parties. Some people went to churches Like there's like a list of different organizations that would help people. So that they would go to that and try to find, but it's the landlord's responsibility to collect security deposit.
That's really interesting too, because you'd think for some people, if they're on Section 8, they might have difficulty being able to afford the security deposit. Yeah. So if you're a landlord, you're doing Section 8, make sure you're getting that security deposit. It's not going to get covered on the back end. So you had another mention here. The fourth thing that you mentioned was following the terms of the lease. What would you have in mind when you wrote that?
Okay, so basically what I had said was like the landlord has to follow the terms of the lease and then also follow the landlord tenant laws for whatever state that they're in. And so basically that would mean like they need to respond to any maintenance requests that the tenant submits, address any health concerns and like any complaints. So just basically holding the landlord accountable for whatever the lease term says.
Is there a different, like, is the lease completely controlled by the landlord like it normally is, where they just bring it to the tenant, or is the housing authority involved with what aspects are mentioned on the lease? Do you know?
No, the lease is between the landlord and the tenant.
Okay. So
like the landlord and the tenant have like a contract, and then the housing authority and the landlord have a contract. But the housing authority is not involved between the tenant and the landlord.
Okay. The last thing that you had here as far as landlord responsibilities, you mentioned raising rent. How is that handled with Section 8?
Okay, so across the board, I just said that basically the housing authority will let the landlord know. Like, for example, maybe the housing authority says you need to provide a 90-day notice. 90 days before the tenant's lease is up, you need to submit your request. So for the city of Phoenix, we had ours listed. There was a calendar listed on there, but nobody ever went on the website to look at the calendar. So people would be submitting the rental request out of season, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I would definitely, as a landlord, if the housing authority doesn't provide it for you, then I would ask them, I'm interested. When do I need to submit the rental request? But usually it was like, it could be 30, 60 or 90 days before the tenant's lease is up.
Okay. So just be aware that maybe your state has a certain notification law as far as how far ahead you have to submit for raising rent. But for Section 8, it could be different from what your state law is than what you're saying.
Yeah. And then also I wanted to say that the housing authority, they also do a comp check. So to make sure that the landlord is not asking for unreasonable rent compared to everyone else in the vicinity. So you couldn't go from like 600 to 900 when everything around you is going for 650, because then you will get denied.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. All right. Going to the tenant side of things. Okay. So the tenant must live in the unit was the first thing you mentioned.
Yes.
Seems pretty basic, right? But is there some sort of check that the housing authority does or something on that?
Well, basically, you would think it would be. So basically, the voucher holder has to be the one to live in the unit, and they can't lease out their unit. But you would be surprised because people would say that they were living there, would find out they lived somewhere else, and then that's a violation, and then they could lose their housing voucher. So they have to be where they say they're going to be.
Okay. It's pretty cut and dry, I think. Yeah. For the second mention that you had in here for the tenant is the responsibility for the security deposit. Why'd you mention that?
Just because the tenant is responsible for the security deposit on their own. I just put that part in there too, so that I just wanted to reiterate that the security deposit is solely on the tenant and just nothing to do with the housing authority.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. The third mention here for the tenant is the portion of rent. So what did you have in mind with this?
Okay, so basically for the tenant is responsible for the tenant portion of the rent, and the housing authority is responsible for the housing authority portion of the rent. So no matter what, like the tenant is responsible to pay that portion of the rent every single month. And if the tenant doesn't pay their portion of the rent, the housing authority isn't going to make up the difference. So It's like each party is responsible for their own part of the rent.
Okay. All right, that's good to know. Jen had a pretty good question, but I'm going to get to that at the end, Jen. Hopefully she can hear me fine too. I know Demetrius was having trouble with the audio on his end, but Jen, if you want to let me know with a comment, if you can hear us fine, that'd be great. So moving to the fourth question here for the tenant responsibility, you mentioned notifying the housing authority of changes in family size or income. And we do have volume from Jen. She said, I know Demetrius said that he had trouble hearing us, so it might just be an isolated incident there. So running that by you again. I'm sorry. I said a bunch. Notifying the housing authority of changes in family size or income.
Okay. So that, for example, like if the tenant's income increases, so say you have a tenant, they weren't working, but now that they are, so it's their responsibility to let us know. And then, I'm just thinking, okay. So to let the housing authority know,
okay.
And then the housing authority can recalculate what the tenant portion of the rent is. Also, so it was whether the tenant, got a new job or they lost the job or someone in their family started working again. Like any changes, they were responsible to let the housing authority know.
Okay. I don't think this question is going to derail us too much. This came from Demetrius, who can hear us now, which is good.
I see it.
Yeah. So he asked, can you evict the tenant if their portion isn't paid?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking with that. Didn't want to speak out of turn. But yeah, it's just a regular renter, right? Yep. They're just not paying the rent on time. And even though it might just be a small portion of it, they're still not paying their portion of the rent. So,
but I will say you can't evict a tenant if the housing authority doesn't pay their part. Like if you're not getting your money from the housing authority, then contact the housing authority. Because several times I ran into that. Landlords were trying to evict the tenant because they didn't get their check from Section 8. Yeah, you can't do that. You need to contact Section 8 if you're not getting your money from them.
That makes sense. That's a good point to bring up. Jen's got a question here too. She said, does Section 8 does anything if there's non-tenants living in the house, like if they found out they were not on the lease? So yeah, okay. So they have roommates or something, maybe they're splitting it with, but they're not Section 8. Do you know if that, plays into things, or how does that work?
What I do know is that for the voucher, like everyone has to be on the voucher. So okay. Yeah, everyone that has to be on the voucher. But say you had a house and there was like a couple, you guys were splitting it. But if Section 8 has nothing to do with the other person, then it doesn't matter. But if Section 8 is paying that other person's rent, then that person would need to be on your voucher.
Okay.
Like everybody has to be on the voucher.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Okay. The fifth thing you mentioned for a tenant responsibility is notice to vacate. How does that work for the tenant when they're looking to vacate the property?
Okay, so when the tenant wants to move, they have to tell the housing authority and the landlord. So basically, under the normal circumstances, the tenant can move when their lease is up. You have to fulfill 1 year. And then, so you can move after the year is up, or if if it's a month to month. You usually have to do a 30 to 60-day notice. But for the yearly lease, the tenant was responsible to give the landlord a 30-day notice before moving out so that the landlord can find new tenants and also so the housing authority could stop sending the voucher payment to the landlord.
Okay. All right. Which I'm sure, landlords probably wouldn't mind if they accidentally kept sending that, but have you ever
happened before? Happened before.
What happens in those situations?
Well, after that, then Section 8 will come back to you and collect the money.
Okay.
When they figure it out. Yeah, you'll have to pay them back.
So if you get an extra, Section 8 payment, don't run to the casino and blow it. They're going to come back for it. So
yeah.
Okay. A general question now. Okay. Who is on Section 8?
Okay. So yeah, I saw that. Okay. So basically the best way to say that is, okay, I would say that people who are on Section 8, well, basic from state to state, but it's kind of like people being homeless, like people, I don't know, it's just like a factor, like it's like job circumstances, anything can happen for you to be on Section 8. It could be anywhere from like a single mom to, an elderly adult. It's not like there's no like stereotypical type of person that is on Section 8. They're not like drug users or convicts or anything like that. It's just that people are having a tough time, and it's like, you pour in your money, your taxes all the time. So sometimes you need help back from all the money that you've been giving. So, but it's just different circumstances. I met a lot of different people on Section 8. And so it's just kind of like the same thing. Like, why are people homeless? Stuff happens. And it's kind of like most of America lives paycheck to paycheck, and people are like a paycheck away from being homeless for real. So,
okay. All right. You had a question here. They said the advantages of becoming a Section 8 landlord, because I'm sure most of our landlords that are listening, like they're thinking, all right, if I can have the majority of the rent being paid automatically on time, that's probably one of them. But what other advantages do you want to mention?
Also, okay, so it's target market. So it's a consistent consumer base because there's forever a million people that I want to be on Section 8. There's a million people on the waiting list. There's a million people with vouchers and not enough places to live. So you'll always have a constant rental basis. And then, so that was one of the things. And then also, your tenants will be pre-screened, like to the point as in like about felonies and things like that. There's certain things that Section 8 will not accept. So that, you get a little pre-screening, but still, like I said before, it's up to the landlord to make sure. But you'll get that consistent payment, and then you'll always have a consistent tenant base. So you won't have to go out and search new tenants. And I know a lot of people had problems with Section 8, but it's like you also need to think about it compared to people's horror stories with non-Section 8 tenants. Like, people are people. And if they're bad tenants, they're going to be bad tenants, no matter who's paying their rent.
Yeah, I think sometimes when somebody says that Section 8 tenants are all this way or that way, it might just be more of an indicator of your screening process having flaws in it. Because I'm sure, you can find great renters. I remember when I was actually looking to purchase my first rental property, one of the properties I was looking at had a Section 8 tenant. I didn't know what that meant. I was 23. And the lady seemed amazing. Her apartment was immaculate, and I couldn't believe the rent that was already being paid for, but wasn't a good rental property fit. Got a good question here from Demetrius. He said, how long does it take to receive payment from the housing authority if purchasing a property that already is occupied with Section 8 tenants? So did you have to deal with any of that as far as like the landlord or the property owner is changing hands while there's a Section 8 tenant in the property?
Yeah, I did. But honestly, I kind of feel like that depends on the housing authority and how the housing authority is run, like how efficient they are of turning things over. So I can only speak for the housing authority that I was at, and it wasn't super efficient when it came to turning things over. And also a lot of times too, is that properties changed hands and nobody told Section 8 anything. 3-4 months would go by, and then, you would realize that had happened. And so there was a lack of communication there too. I do know that when landlords were signing up and getting their property on, I always told them at least a month or two before you would get paid. So don't use that Section 8 property to cover your mortgage for that house. Have a couple months saved up, because it's not going to be immediate turnarounds. You're not going to get paid immediately.
So if you're not getting paid immediately on that, then they just catch up at a certain point, or maybe there'll just be a delay a couple months out.
It might be like a month or two delay, and then you'll get a chunk, and then it'll start a flow.
Right. And from your experience at the housing authority that you worked at, Section 8 payments, are those just being usually cut by check, or how is that being done?
They were doing it by check, but then right before I left, I think they switched over to electronic, and they were just going to do it electronically, which is so much faster. So I think that depends on the housing authority.
Okay. All right. Do you have any other advice or insights that you want to give on Section 8, or give people an opportunity to ask questions that they have? Actually, you know what? While you're thinking of that, I'll pull one up from Jen. Okay. She had said, let's see, this might be out of the wheelhouse, but she said, what about service animals and ESAs? If you're exempt federally and statewide from having to accept them, is there recourse with Section 8? Would they back you up? Yeah. I think that's kind of the usual response we get when you have a ESA section, question like that. You'd probably want to, consult somebody locally in your state and talk to your housing authority.
Yeah, because I can only speak on the housing authority that I worked at, so I don't really know too much about that. That only came up maybe once. So. Yeah, I think that depends on your state, and I can't answer that question in all the way, so I'm not even going to try to give you a crazy answer. Okay.
If people do have any other questions that are watching right now, feel free to ask them. In the meantime, I'm going to throw your website up on here. That's right, the Landlord Liaisons.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so tell us what you're doing with that. What's the premise of that?
Okay, so it's only a couple months old. So basically, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to like help landlords across the board. So I'm coming up with like different programs, like one to introduce people about being a Section 8 tenant, but I'm selling it as learn how to expand your portfolio using government money, because that sounds way better.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to do that. I'm also going to partner with some mortgage brokers that I met out here and some other people that are into flipping houses. So we will come together and help landlords, expand their portfolio, and things like that. And then also just like basic classes and workshops. Like a lot of people I felt didn't know anything about the landlord tenant law as well. And so I wanted to like help people with that and just basically going over that. Like I didn't even know anything about it. And so I had to print it out so I could understand what was going on. And then just basically the thing why I started the Landlord Liaisons is because when I was working at Section 8, it was people, the landlords didn't know what was going on and they would get frustrated. There was a lack of communication. The landlord would just decide, hey, I don't want to do Section 8 anymore. This is my notice. Then the tenant would get a 30-day notice. And then if you're on Section 8, you don't have extra money saved up, and they would end up homeless. And it happened over and over and over again. And I'm like, this is crazy. How can I solve this problem? And then boom, that's how that came about.
Okay. Very cool. I love it. I think a lot of landlords starting out could even use help even without Section 8 being involved.
Exactly.
But you throw Section 8 and all of a sudden there's this whole other, thing that you're considering and you're getting confused on. So I got another good question from Demetrius here. Demetrius, you're on fire. From your personal experience, have you heard of Section 8 not having their voucher taken away from them after being evicted?
No. Where I was working at, when somebody got evicted, they lost their voucher.
Okay.
Plain and simple. You're supposed to lose your voucher, plain and simple. So
I would imagine some of that would have to do with the landlord. If you're going through the eviction process, obviously it's being officially documented in the court system. So is that probably what the housing authority is doing? They're getting a notification that this person's been evicted automatically, or
because the landlord has to send, if you go through the whole proceeding, you have to like send the housing authority the notice. You have to send them the eviction paperwork. You have to send them everything. So they have to be like in the loop. Then if the tenant wants to fight it, then the tenant can schedule a meeting with the housing authority, and then they go through and they do a case review, and then they make up their decision whether or not they're going to, the tenant will lose the voucher or not. And I've seen it happen when people lost vouchers. That's how people lose vouchers, because their voucher expired.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. How does that work as far as the expiration? I mean, when somebody gets a voucher, they already know what the expiration date is.
We tell them. But the problem was, to be honest, like in the city of Phoenix, there's so many landlords that decided they weren't going to do Section 8 anymore. So, and then you have like 5 people fighting over the same one house. So people with vouchers would run out because there was nowhere for them to live, because nobody wants to do Section 8 because it has such a bad taste in people's mouth.
Gotcha. All right. So do you consult with landlords just in the Phoenix area, or are you nationwide, or how's that work?
I would like to be nationwide. I'm just starting up here because that's where I am. But I'm hoping to be nationwide. Like I'm hoping this is going to be something that will be able to help landlords like across the country. But I'm trying to master my area where I'm at first.
So if somebody's watching and they happen to be in our Facebook group, Rent Prep for Landlords, is that fine if they were to reach out and contact you?
Yeah, sure.
And what I'll do is, if we get Section 8 questions in the future, I'll try to tag you in those so that you can kind of be the voice of reason for a bunch of people like me who have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to Section 8.
Okay.
So, I think that's it for the questions we got here. I'll throw it up on screen again if somebody wants to check out your website.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the time. We appreciate it. It looks like we do have one other question.
Oh, okay.
Let's see what it is here. Does my lease supersede the housing authorities, or can you clarify the in and outs of the housing agreement? So I'm guessing this is talking about the lease with the tenant, and then also the housing agreement with the housing association. Does one supersede the other, or?
No, because they're like, there's 2 separate agreements. So there's the agreement between the landlord and the housing authority, and then there's the lease between the landlord and the tenant. So
they don't really overlap as far as
the housing authority, Section 8 has nothing to do with that lease. Like their name is not on it or anything. So if the tenant breaks something, on the lease, that's between the landlord and the tenant. Section 8 doesn't get involved. So they're 2 separate things, because basically all Section 8 is, it's like it's like if I'm renting and I can't pay my rent and my mom's paying part of my rent, like that's it. She's got nothing to do with anything else, with the lease part. She's just giving me money to pay the rent. And then that's the difference. I feel like what I did notice was a lot of times people jumped into being a Section 8 landlord, but then they didn't really understand how the program worked, and they would ask questions afterwards. So I would always tell people, if this is something that you want to do, don't wait for the housing authority to give you the information, because if it's run poorly, they won't. Try to find the information out on yourself. You can ask someone like me or contact the housing authority and just, try to figure out and get all your ducks in a row before you do it so that you're prepared. Because it's a beast of a thing, for real.
Yeah. One of the things, I love it. One of the things that I've noticed too is we'll get questions about Section 8 from people in the group, and they'll say stuff like, I have a tenant that's destroying the property. It's Section 8. What do I do? And really the answer is they're just a normal tenant at that point.
Right.
If they're violating the lease, you serve them the notice, you serve them the eviction, and you go through the eviction process.
Yep. You treat them just like everybody else.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, again, thank you for taking the time. And sure, I'm going to be tagging you in questions in the future as Section 8 comes up in the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. And good luck with the project. It'll be interesting to watch from afar as it grows, and hopefully get some people reaching out to you with some questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I've never done any Facebook Live thing, so it wasn't that scary. So.
Yeah, we had a little tech hiccup there for a a little bit, but we're good. Yeah, it went well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.